The case of Google Maps is, I think, a really excellent illustration of value creation in an ecosystem context. Now, in a traditional market view, one might think that such a good service as Google Maps is something that you would want to charge for. You would want to prevent people from using it unless they came with a particular fee, and then of course they would be allowed to access. This is kind of the traditional view of a market, and this is of course what might have happened in the past. You would have a company with a really good service like Google Maps, and they would charge people for the use of that service and try to generate a profit on that basis. But in the case of Google Maps, as we all know, that is an open resource. Anyone can come in if they have particular technology to access it. If they have internet and a device that is compatible, they can simply open Google Maps and find anything they want, virtually anything they want. They find a location, they can find directions to a particular location, the best buses to get, the best routes, the best trains, and so on and so forth. So it's a really amazing open source service. The question one might ask is, well, why are they doing this? Why aren't Google actually charging a price for the use of this service? Why is it free? It doesn't seem to make sense from a traditional perspective. But if you look at it in a more holistic way, you begin to see the advantages from Google's point of view, and indeed from the point of view of all the participants within an ecosystem. One of those participants, for example, might be a hotel. So you might have a hotel with a website, and they will embed Google Maps within their website in order to show people how to get to the hotel, where exactly it's located in a particular city or area. And then you have further layers on top of that. For example, you have companies like Trivago, which is basically a hotel search engine in itself. And Trivago is a place where people go to compare prices of different hotels and to try and find the best value. And of course, Trivago then as well is likely to want to use Google in its website. It wants customers or potential customers to know where to find the particular hotels, what their location is relative to other potential hotels that they might want to use. And of course, Google Maps is an excellent service in that context. And the thing is, of course, you might think, well, this is a one-way value system. You've got these hotels on the one hand are gaining value from Google Maps, and Trivago is gaining value from Google Maps as well. But there is a mutual benefit here. There's mutuality going on, and there's orchestration going on, and it is a two-way benefit because, of course, when you have new hotels coming on the scene, they might be very anxious to register with Trivago, for example. They want to be registered on their website, listed as one of the potential hotels in a particular area. And Google might not yet be aware of this new hotel. And so once it's registered on Trivago's system, this can then feed back into the Google Maps system, and Google can then update its maps on the basis of the emergence of these new commercial entities, and it can edit and add in the fact that there's a hotel in this particular location. And the same goes then on the other side when you have independent hotel websites. They come online and they want to link up with Google Maps and indicate their location in Google Maps, and of course that feeds back then into the Google Maps system. So you have this two-way benefit. And of course, you have the fact that people are going onto Google's platform. It's channeling people towards Google's Maps platform, and thereby as well, it's going to make people more aware of Google. It's increasing its brand awareness and brand recognition. It means people are more likely then to think of Google when they want to search for something, even if it's not on the maps. They just want to use the general search engine. And of course, in the long term, that redounds to the benefit of Google because, of course, it allows them to generate more advertising revenues. And that's obviously the fundamental basis of their business model. But they've taken this long-term perspective, you see. They're thinking much, much further ahead. They're not thinking in short-term profit generation terms. They're not thinking in that traditional sense of, well, we've got this really good service, let's try and make an immediate profit by charging people for the use of the service. They thought, no, let's just make this open to everyone. It's an amazing service. Anyone can use it anytime they want. other businesses can use it, even potentially conceived rivals like Trivago. Because when you think about it, Trivago is actually a search engine of sorts for hotels. And you might think, well, they're kind of going up against Google, really. In fact, even if you look at their logo, there's a huge overlap in terms of its aesthetic with Google, the color scheme and so on, and the simplicity of it. You might think, wow, that's pretty close to the bone there for Google. They're really going up against them, and yet Google allows Trivago to use its Google Maps free of charge, no strings attached. Well, that's because Google perceives that long-term value creation, not just for itself, but for all participants within the network. Of course, it does benefit itself, but it's a kind of a delayed benefit. They're putting it off into the future. They don't need it right now. Now, you might think, if you're cynical, you might think, well, Google is different because Google is such a huge organization. They have so much money that they can afford to give these kinds of things away for free. But I think that's a bit too cynical, and I think it's a little bit actually inaccurate, because Google has always had this kind of outlook from their inception, right from the beginning. They were really, really interested in this idea of open source utilities and services and developing things that almost anyone could access. And that was really, really at the heart of what they were doing. Of course, their advertising revenue model is right at the heart of it. And of course, that depends on footfall to their search engine. And that's obviously what allows them to have these different services as being free. But it's a brave kind of stance nonetheless. It's a very bold move, and it's certainly one, I think, that's characteristic of this new way of thinking about the business environment as an ecosystem and taking that longer term perspective. I think the Google Maps case is a really good case in point when it comes to understanding what ecosystems are all about. So then, let's sum up some of the main differences between the traditional view of the market and industry and in business environment in general, and the ecosystem's perspective on business environments. So we have the traditional view here on the left and the ecosystem view on the right. So the traditional view was very much an organization-centric or inward-looking view, focused primarily on their own internal activities and serving the needs of the end customer in order to generate a profit and returns to shareholders. On the other hand, with the ecosystem view, we're looking at a much more environment or external or outward-looking view. We're really looking at how they can create value and contribute to value creation in the overall environment for all participants, not necessarily just for themselves. You have in the traditional view the organization as independent, and in the ecosystem view, you're looking at the organization as one of many participants who are potentially collaborating. The traditional view then operates traditional methods, physical stores, and a very linear focus when it comes to things like market research. You're looking at supply, you're looking at distribution channels, you're looking at customers and customer behaviors and so on in a very linear way, whereas in the ecosystem view, it's supported by emerging and evolving technologies, digital business platforms, big data, and all sorts of complex interactions and interdependencies. Then in the traditional view, they tend to be slower to react to external changes, the organizations within the traditional marketplace, whereas in the ecosystem view, we're looking at very quick to react organizations. They're really looking to be able to adapt and change and evolve, because this is an ecosystem that is evolving as well, changing circumstances, much more so than in traditional markets, via collaboration with other participants. The traditional view organizations tend to be set in their ways. They kind of stick to the old way of doing things for as long as they possibly can. Whereas in the ecosystem view, they're almost anticipating and expecting that they're going to have to change things, constantly adapt and so on. So they're forward thinking, and they're actually open and friendly to disruption, because they see that as a form of value creation and a potential way for them as well to create and add value. Self-interested in the traditional view, adversarial and driven primarily by the profit motive. Profit, of course, remains important in the ecosystem view, but it's not the only or necessarily even the most dominant motivation. There's also an openness to other participants, of collaboration with other participants, committed to long-term value creation for all participants within the ecosystem, as we saw in the case, for example, of Google Maps. Now, I don't want to suggest, of course, that this is exactly how organizations operate in either the traditional marketplace or in the modern ecosystem environment. And of course, it's not the case that all modern business environments are now ecosystems and there's no place at all for traditional views or traditional ways of doing things. That, of course, would be a caricature and it would be a very unrealistic way of looking at the world. You shouldn't be tempted to divide the world up into these neat kind of packets where you have the traditional view on one hand, the ecosystem view on the other hand, and it's one or the other. Of course, things are a little bit more complex than that. We're still very much in a situation of evolution away from traditional circumstances, away from traditional views, traditional organizations, and towards these more experimental, collaborative, and open ecosystem kinds of networks and organizations. But you can think of companies as being tending towards one or towards the other. An organization might tend more towards an ecosystem outlook, an ecosystem perspective, or it might tend a little bit more towards the traditional view. And I don't want to suggest, of course, that the traditional view has no place and has no purpose. It is, of course, still very important to serve your shareholders, to generate profits, because, of course, if you can't generate profits, you're not going to last very long in any environment, whether it's traditional or whether it's the ecosystem. So these are kinds of useful heuristics, useful frameworks for thinking about the modern business environment. And organizations will generally fall somewhere kind of in between these two extremes. And you can try to place particular real world examples on this spectrum, if you like, as a useful exercise. You can think of some famous organizations and ask yourself, well, are they demonstrating more traditional characteristics? Are they operating in a kind of traditional market and industry? Do they conceive of themselves as operating in a traditional market or industry? Or are these organizations more in the ecosystem mindset? Are they demonstrating some of those ecosystem characteristics in the way that they operate? So I think that's a useful little exercise that you can do in your own time. I want to finish with, I think, what is a really important quotation. Often when people talk about things like business ecosystems, they can become a little bit jaded, a bit cynical, and they might think, well, this is just more business jargon. It doesn't really change anything. It's just people use these words to feel good about themselves or to make themselves feel like they're doing something different or new or unique. I think this quotation from Deloitte is actually very useful when it comes to addressing that kind of more cynical perspective. They say, especially given the diverse usage of the term ecosystem, it might be tempting to dismiss ecosystem as just another management buzzword in an increasingly jargon-congested business lexicon. Certainly, the term has so far defied a precise and universally agreed definition. I think you will agree that that's the case based on all of the different examples that we've been looking at, despite valiant efforts by many academics and theorists. But the concept's rapid spread and uptake points to a practical utility that should not be underestimated. So I think this is a very important point to bear in mind. The fact that the ecosystem idea has gained such currency and that it is being used quite widely now, I think that's prima facie evidence that this is in fact something that has value, something that has merit, and something that does have real world application. At a bare minimum, it has provided many businesses with a powerful metaphor from the natural world. Metaphors matter. They make it easier to explore and understand abstract concepts and inform the decision-making heuristics and mental models that leaders use to make confident choices and take timely action. Our business metaphors have historically been drawn largely from machinery and engineering, warfare in the military, and competitive sports and games. These remain apt in many ways, of course, but in increasingly dynamic, collaborative, and interdependent situations, they might mislead us just as much as they inform. I think that's a wonderful summary of the ecosystem idea of why it is actually potentially very important and useful from a business perspective.